Normally, when you watch a movie, you want to forget you're watching a movie. You want to kind of you want to kind of get so lost in it that you remember that you forget you're in a movie theater and you feel like it's all real. When you watch a really good, watch Avengers Endgame or something, you just watch the whole thing and you just feel like you're in that world. And when someone dies, you're like, oh shit, a person I know died. David Lynch does things that sort of take you out of the movie, which is normally not what you would want to do. But David Lynch is interested in thinking about how movies work. And I mentioned all that doubling where an actor becomes a character, but in this movie, the character becomes two people. Or characters have more than one name, just like an actor would have a name and then the character would have a name. David Lynch has a couple of things to kind of draw your attention to the fact that you're watching a movie. So the scream that the guy, when Mr. Eddie pulls that guy over on the side of the road and beats him to death, he screams in this particularly famous way. It's called a Wilhelm scream, and it's just a famous scream that's used in dozens and dozens and dozens of old movies, cowboy movies. It's in Star Wars. It's just a famous. It's just a really high pitched yell. And it's used in a lot of movies. So when you hear it, you're like, oh, that reminds me of all these other screams in Hollywood movies. Like they're literally having the scene where Mr. Eddie beats the guy, the Hollywood sign is visible. During the car chase, it's not like a really good Fast and Furious chase. They literally just speed the film up, which is what they do in like old movies. I don't know if you remember, but at the end of Rear Window, when everybody comes running out of their apartment, when Jimmy Stewart's falling out the window, in order to capture the excitement, Hitchcock just played the film a little bit faster. So people, they're running, and then Hitchcock sped it up so they're running faster, but it's like a very fake effect. And there's quite a bit of that. In this movie. Like when Pete sees Alice for the first time, she looks so beautiful, but there's also light flickering on her face. But it's not the kind of light that would actually be in the room with her. It looks like someone has a giant movie screen near her and there's flickering light on her face like from a movie screen. And again, because I told you every movie, movies are a form of thinking. And this movie is thinking about movies and how they're made and how they work and how they double you and how they steal your soul and what you learn from them. And so it's interesting that Alice is introduced, that song, that Magic Moment song plays. And she's shown in this sort of flickering light. It's just a sort of really fascinating choice. Okay, cool. As the film progresses, notice, by the way, that I mentioned in the last video that sometimes it feels one way of thinking about the relationship between Pete and Fred is that Pete is what Fred wishes he was. That Fred can't satisfy a woman sexually, but Pete can satisfy more than one woman sexually. But Pete's situation is quite different from Fred's, but it becomes more similar. Notice that Alice is introduced wearing all white, but very quickly Alice goes into black. With darker lipstick. Again, like it's like she's headed back into being Renee, the character we're familiar with earlier, even though she keeps her blonde hair. Notice also there's like a direct reference to Vertigo. When Pete is thinking about Alice, you see her floating head above all the swirls of stuff, just exactly straight out of Vertigo when Jimmy Stewart is kind of thinking about Kim Novak's character. Cool. Notice, by the way, that when Pete and Alice have sex, there's actually a camera shot that's very similar to the shot of Fred and Renee, meant to remind you of that. And again, it helps to emphasize the difference. Pete is able to satisfy Alice, but Fred is not able to satisfy Renee. And I think it's important to understand that sort of the sexual dysfunction of Fred's relationship is what led him to kill Renee. It's that he couldn't sexually satisfy her, he was totally humiliated, he didn't know how to deal with that humiliation, and he decided to solve the problem by murdering the person who knew he wasn't good at sex. The movie never comes out and says that, but it's his masculinity, he feels like, is in question, and so he wants to solve this problem by sort of killing his wife, so that Fred kills Renee because he can't sexually satisfy her. She knows his dark secret, which is that he feels he's not a real man, and so he murders her. But then when he heads into if you want to think about the Pete story as a fantasy land of Fred's, and it's possible to do that, although don't overdo it, and I'll talk why about that a little bit later. Actually, I'll talk about that now. I read the internet has theories about what to make sense out of David Lynch movies. You sort of type in Lost Highway, explain it to me, and you get these explanations. The explanations, when you first read them, you're like, oh, this movie is solved. but it's not solved. It's not a good explanation. So one explanation I've heard, for example, that students like because it makes sense out of something, they see David Lynch and it's something confusing and they want to make sense out of it. So they go on the internet and they go, explain Lost Highway to me. And so one of the explanations that you'll see on the internet is that Fred kills Alice and then he goes to the electric chair. And everything with Pete is like a crazy fantasy he has at the moment of his electrocution. And that's why you see so much electricity at different points in the movie. And it's why one of the last things you see of Fred is a kind of electricity shocking, his head is shaking, that's him in the electric chair or whatever. It's an interesting, when you first hear it, you're like, oh, maybe that's what the movie's about. It's the Pete stuff is just a crazy fantasies of Fred when he's being killed in the electric chair, and that explains the electricity. It doesn't. Just for starters, if you're going to believe that theory, then you got to believe that Fred's life is normal and that all the weird stuff in Pete's world is explained because, like, Fred's having a psychotic, schizophrenic fantasy world. But, like, the videotapes in Fred's life were impossible. So it's not like Fred's world was so realistic and normal. Fred met the mystery man. How normal is that? And the important thing I want to point out is that movies are not something you're supposed to decode. I mean, sometimes some of the bad ones are, some of the stupid ones are, but students are often like, this movie doesn't make sense. It's like a code. Let's decode it. I think it's better to think of movies as being sort of like dreams, and they suggest things. Sometimes they suggest contradictory things. For example, Captain America suggests bullies are bad. That's why Captain America fights bad guys, because he doesn't like bullies. But it also suggests being a bully is good, because Captain America's whole thing is punching people until they agree with him. So movies do complex, contradictory work. It's not about solving it or decoding it. It's just about noticing all of the things it's bringing up and thinking about them and then holding all of these complicated things in your head. You're not solving the movie. You're just noticing what it's connecting with, what it resonates, what ideas it suggests. And importantly, in your essays, you're not allowed to contradict yourself. But movies are allowed to contradict themselves. Dreams are allowed to contradict themselves. And so you may be living in a contradictory, when you're watching a David Lynch movie in particular, you're in a weird sort of contradictory zone. But there's a lot of, but doesn't mean it's nonsense. It doesn't mean it's gibberish. There are ideas in there. They're just not presented in a logical way. But that doesn't mean they're not real. All right, so let's kind of keep talking about this stuff. Pete's parents, they talk about that night. No one will tell him what happened. And it seems like Pete was on the lawn with Sheila and something crazy happened, and I don't know. He vanished into some kind of fucked up wound and then ended up in Fred's place in prison where they found him? I don't know. Oh, hold on. Someone is here. I will pick this up in the next